Moshmi, shall I start? Okay. Morning. Welcome to day 2 of the winter school. My name is Shreekant Gupta. I'm a professor at the department here, and I work on environmental economics and climate change. Uh, when Mahatma Gandhi went to meet King George, they said, "Were you not feeling underdressed?" And he said he was wearing enough for both. So that goes for. It's fading in and out. Is that it's okay? Maybe it's just me. So I have a 5-page introduction written up for Michael. Just kidding. So it is really a pleasure and a privilege to welcome Professor Michael Greenstone to the Delhi School of Economics. This is your first visit, I believe. Though he's no stranger to India, he's probably here often enough that we can probably make him an honorary citizen of this country. So he's currently the Milton Friedman Distinguished Service Professor in Economics at Chicago, but also wears several other hats. He heads the Energy Policy Institute at Chicago, the Becker Friedman Institute at Chicago. What's really interesting about Michael is, to my mind, he's the quintessential scholar practitioner. So as far as his academic credentials are concerned, I don't think any of us in this room need any introduction, having been formerly a chaired professor at MIT, a former editor of the Journal of Political Economy, which is sort of the holy grail for many of us. But what's really interesting for me and for us in India is that he walks the talk in terms of being a practitioner. And not only for issues in the United States, but more importantly for us, for issues in the developing world, particularly China and India. So he was also the chief economist to the Council of Economic Advisors of the Obama administration. But also I was quite intrigued that, and I was asking him earlier as to how he started working on issues in India and in China. And I noticed that your first paper on India was in the Economic and Political Weekly with Esther Duflo and Rema Hanna, called Indoor Air Pollution, Respiratory Health, and Rural Odisha. So here you have someone who's published in journals ranging from Econometrica to EPW, and that's really quite inspiring and quite impressive. Just a couple of more words on his work, particularly the kind of lectures we will be hearing today. So Michael's work straddles climate change, air pollution, energy, and we will hear aspects of all of that. But again, as I said, for us in India, his scholarship and his actual work of sort of getting into the nitty-gritty of policy making, particularly with regard to air pollution, which is a burning issue, pun intended, is quite significant. And one thing that I hope we can engage with Michael is his equally impressive work in China. So he has been working on Chinese environmental issues for quite some time, and has shown quite convincingly how China has been successful in massively improving its air and water quality, and by corollary, an improvement in its life expectancy. So when we have our environment minister stand up in parliament and say there is no evidence to link air pollution with excess mortality, I think that's quite an interesting observation. And I think we in India, given that we have this very interesting relationship with China, have a lot to understand as to how and why China has been able to improve its air and water quality so massively. So without further ado, I will hand over the floor to Michael. He just told me that, so I know he's a very clear expositor, so I was going to say no questions till the end of the talk, but to the contrary, he said you encourage questions. So he would like sort of a more interactive presentation or participation. So Michael, the floor is yours. How long? We have till 11. It's not all in. So I'm going to move that.
Oh, yes. Is that good? You know what? Good. Okay. All right. Thank you very much for that kind. No. Okay, thank you very much for that kind invitation, kind introduction, and it's my great honor to be here. I've heard about this winter school for so many years, and was really amazingly honored to be able to be asked and to be able to participate. So I have 3 lectures today. This one will try to give kind of an overall picture. We'll dive into individual papers along the way, and then there'll be kind of more in-depth analyses in the second and third, maybe slightly more focused. I do think this is something, the University of Chicago has a reputation as being sometimes a little rough and tumble, where people, the saying is, you're only as good as your last paper, and there's constant criticism of your work, which helps build better ideas. So actually interrupting and complaining is actually a form of affection. So I will take it, I encourage it. If there's something I say that doesn't make sense or that just generally bothers you, or feel free to ask a question, or just say that you think it's wrong. So, oops, okay. So this picture is meant to capture actually and this is from China, and I'll show an Indian picture in a second. What I'd like to think of as the global energy challenge is kind of the overall set of issues that animates animates my research. And I think what every society here in Delhi, Mumbai, or all of India, China, United States are struggling with is this global energy challenge. You could think of it as a stool that has 3 legs. The first leg of the stool is, how do you make sure that you have access to inexpensive and reliable sources of energy? And this picture really captures it. Since early 1990s, China has had, I think of it as one of the most important economic events in the history of humankind. This massive growth in income that has hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. That was made possible by access to inexpensive and reliable energy. And it got this guy in a cab probably not that long ago, before the picture was taken. He was probably on a bike, and it's going to not be that long to the bike is in a cab. And all of that was let loose by inexpensive and reliable source of energy. So that's leg 1 of the stool. The second leg of the stool, which is why I like this picture so much, is because it's so visible, is that same energy that unlocked all that economic growth also caused this. And so that's like the middle of the day in Beijing. This is now 7 or 8 years old, this picture. And can't see the sun. The guy's wearing a mask that's like pre-COVID. And he's wearing a mask because he knows air pollution is terrible. And he's even got goggles on. And so how do you avoid the local air pollution or local environmental problems associated with all that energy consumption? And then the third leg of the stool is not visible, but it's there too, which is the same fossil fuels that unlocked all that economic growth and that are causing all this air pollution are causing disruptive, or certainly increasing the odds of disruptive climate change. And so if you take anything away from this first talk, it's that I think it's a terrible mistake to think only of the climate problem. There's not just a climate problem in isolation, or an air pollution problem only in isolation, or an energy access problem in isolation. What every society is trying to do is to find a way to balance between those three goals. And the painful part of that is that requires trade-offs. It's very hard to think of, almost impossible to think of anything that accomplishes all three at once. And those trade-offs, there's no right magic trade-off. That what the trade-off is right in Los Angeles is not the same trade-off that's going to be right in Delhi, is not the same trade-off that's going to be right in Shanghai. And so much of what I try to do, and much of how I'd like you to begin to think about the world, is that the world is trying to accomplish these three things at once, and it's going to involve these trade-offs, and those trade-offs are going to reflect things like values, things like economics, things like politics, things like democracy or political pressure, and how the government responds to political pressure. And it's this kind of witch's brew of things that all produce what's in this picture or outside that window. Okay. I set my research assistants after finding something that I thought so perfectly captured the global energy challenge, except in India, this is the best they could do. It's all right. It's not, I don't think it quite captures some of the in the same way. Okay, so let me now try to start with 7 facts that I think explain this difficult balance between energy and growth. Some of these facts I think you'll know instinctually. Hopefully I'll display them in an interesting way, and or stitch them together in a new way. So the first, this is not like deep thoughts, like energy is critical for growth. And I like to, we'll see, some of you guys are young, so this might work. It's a joke, so just to warn you in advance. Working with data is, I like to joke that working with data, which I spend a lot of my time doing, if you think back to high school, and probably all of you had much more successful dating careers than I did in high school. But if you think back to high school and you think about your worst boyfriend or your worst girlfriend, in my case, what was true about my worst girlfriend was that every day I knew I would be disappointed. I just didn't know how. And so every day I would find out. And so working with data is like that. You have a view of what the data should say, and inevitably the data is going to disappoint you. You don't quite know how. And the reason I say that in front of this picture is this is a total contradiction of that joke, because the data are speaking so clearly and so loudly. And what they're saying is, for a country to become wealthy, this is log GDP, and then this is log energy consumption. The world has no examples of countries getting wealthy without lots and lots of energy consumption. Zero. So I want you to take that as a fact on the ground. And obviously I've highlighted the US, China, and India here. Okay, the second is that energy access is a major problem around the world. And so here is per capita energy consumption in the United States, per capita electricity consumption. It's probably about, my research assistants have changed the unit a little bit, but we'll call that 12 megawatt hours person. In China, it's maybe 5.5. In India, it's maybe 1. I think it's a little bit higher. In Bihar, it's 0.3. So, and I do a lot of work, a lot of my research is in Bihar. The only point I want to take away is, like, another fact on the ground is this is a totally unacceptable state of affairs for most people on the planet. And there's no version of the world, we're going to come to climate change, there's no version of the world where people in India, I suspect, think that this is an acceptable state of affairs or the way things should be. And there's really no version of the world where people in Bihar think that. And so if your solution to the global energy challenge is we should consume less energy, that I don't I don't think that seems like a very plausible solution. The second or third point, which follows from the second, is that demand is expected to grow very rapidly in today's emerging economies. And so here is going out to about 2050, which as far as I think we can get reliable projections. Projected total energy consumption. This is not per capita, it's just it's a total. And you can see that today's developed countries are roughly flat or maybe slightly declining going out the next 30 years. And you have this massive growth, maybe quadrupling from, well, 1995, but from today, maybe a doubling by the end of the century. And, you know, that's a function of energy is super important for growth. And today's emerging economies are going to be very focused on continuing to grow naturally and correctly. And that's going to lead to lots more energy consumption. Okay, so that's all fine, 1, 2, and 3. Number 4 is, well, what energy are people going to use? There's a lot of talk, rightly so, about the advances in renewables and other energy sources. But when you look at what the standard projections say, the standard projections still, you have massive growth in the non-fossils. This is 2020, so it's more or less now, and very massive growth. But you don't have much decline in the non-fossils. So based on policies in place in 2021, the IEA has non-renewables, that is basically the fossils, down to about 66% of world primary energy consumption in 2050, compared to 79% now. But again, what the planet's going to care about is the total fossil fuel consumption, not its share. So looks like the world is projected to meet that. Now, why is that? I think it's interesting to unpack that in kind of sector by sector. Now, this data I'm about to show you is from the United States. It's going to vary from place to place. But this is the price of producing a kilowatt hour of electricity from various sources. And so there's a lot of information here. So let's just start with the gray guys. The gray guys are the fossil fuels. So think of this as like an existing coal plant, not dissimilar to a coal plant that is here in India today without lots and lots of environmental controls. Here is the price of a kind of high-tech natural gas plant in the United States. We have very inexpensive, due to fracking, we have very inexpensive natural gas. And so that's, you know, maybe a little bit less than 5 cents. A coal plant with lots of environmental controls in the US is probably 8 cents per kilowatt hour. And a nuclear plant, you know, they're basically impossible to build in the United States because they're so far out of the money. And that would be about 10 cents. Okay, so those are the fossils. Now we have as alternatives, we could have these we could have the renewables, but the problem with the renewables, as is often said, the sun doesn't shine all the time and the wind doesn't blow all the time. And so you have to have some backup. You can't just have the electricity turn off when the sun sets every day. And so there's a couple ways to get backups. One is using natural gas plants, which is reintroducing fossil fuels. And the other is using battery backups. So this is showing you the cost of using these sources when you have those backups available. What you can see is you're starting to see the cost really grow. And if you were insisting on no carbon, which the battery backups would provide, you have costs that are 3 or 4 times, 5 times higher per kilowatt hour. And so the reason the IEA has the world projected to continue to rely so heavily on the fossils is that using the non-fossils ends up being pretty expensive. So I want to just pause there and make sure all of that's tracking. Okay. Usually someone gets very upset at me about the battery one and says that can't be true. We still have a long ways to go with the batteries. Oh, sorry, that's the dash line is the price of a combined cycle natural gas plant in the US, which is kind of everything has, that's the low cost provider. So everyone has to compete with that basically. Okay. What about in transportation? So here, what I've done is I have built I've taken the cost of running an electric vehicle, lifetime costs, and running a similar internal combustion engine vehicle, and I've expressed them on the horizontal line. I have the cost of batteries in $20, and I have the price of a barrel of oil in $20. And along the red line, you have pairs of, so the primary cost, long run cost of running an internal combustion engine car is the oil, and the primary one is for the electric vehicle is the battery. And so now I've got pairs of those, and along the red line, you should think of that as equal costs over the long run of having the electric vehicle versus having the internal combustion engine car. And then if you go below on the price of a barrel of oil, then you have those are prices of the barrel of oil where internal combustion engines are cheaper than electric vehicles. And if you go above in the blue region, those are places where oil becomes so expensive that electric vehicles are less expensive. Okay, so if you took Bloomberg New Energy Finance's estimate of the current average battery price, that's about $135. What would be the price of a barrel of oil where it would be equal cost? It'd be like $129. And so does anyone know what the price of a barrel of oil is currently? Now you guys are paying lower prices because you're getting the discount from Russia right now, but we're not getting that in the US, I can assure you that. But it's about, the global price is about $70 right now. So what that's telling you is that the batteries are still too expensive because we're probably down about here somewhere right now. Now we can look at other places. Okay, so this is slightly misabled. What does this say? This is a, oh, okay, that one shouldn't be there. The current WTI crude oil price is about 74, ignore the breaking some batteries, it would be about $84. So you would have to have maybe not quite a halving, but a substantial reduction in the price of batteries, given current oil prices. And of course, now you guys are probably down here, so you'd have to have even lower battery price. So does that make sense? Okay. So what I want you to take away from this is, and now I'm going to slip in a clever phrase, which I want you to pay attention to, is given the way that energy markets are structured, it is no surprise that we're projected to continue to use fossil fuels. Now, why did I insert that phrase, given the way that they're structured? Well, the way they're structured, we basically don't price externalities. And so that, what do I mean by that? When you use fossil fuels, you don't have to pay for the crap in the air, and you don't have to pay for the climate change that you're doing in most parts of the world. And so that is a choice that didn't happen by accident. That's a choice. But that is a choice most societies are making. And when they make that, this is what you get. And you get this too. Okay. And I'm going to come back to that, but I don't want to slip that by you. Okay. Oh, so like another theory, I think this one is not so, is it take people my age to remember this theory. Probably you guys have never even heard it, most of you. People my age, there used to be like, does anyone know what peak oil is? What was peak oil? We were going to run out of oil. The world was going to run out of oil. Probably no one here has ever heard of that. And the reason no one ever heard of it is, here we've got in 1980, and this is why people were talking about peak oil. In 1980, the ratio of what we knew we had, of what we knew we had in the ground to how much we were using in that a given year was about 30. So it's like about 30 to 1. And so now all of you guys are capable of doing tricky math of like, what year would we run out? If it's 30 to 1, we should have run out in 2010. What, of course, has happened is that ratio has grown. And how did that happen? We didn't stop using oil for all those years. It happened because all the people who run the oil and gas companies are very, very smart. And they have found many new reserves. And, you know, even though it is true in some kind of theoretical sense that there's a fixed amount of fossil fuels on the planet, we are finding craftier and craftier ways to get to them all the time. And so I think, at least in the context of climate change, you should totally, and maybe you thought about this, but you should totally take off the table that we're going to run out of fossil fuels. That's, I don't see that happening. Same thing for natural gas. Coal, the data are kind of wonky. I wouldn't pay that much attention to it. We're never, ever going to run out of coal. There's more coal than you could shake a stick at. So you should also take that off the board. Fossil fuels are abundant and they're not going away. No, so that's no, right. But that hasn't happened because the engineers are so smart that they've been able, it's not just that they've been able to find more fossil fuels, they've been able to find more less expensive fossil fuels. So in principle, that we might have thought that was true. And see, you probably believed in peak oil too, but it's possible. So do we have even more than I'm showing? That's possible. Yeah, nobody really knows what Saudi Arabia has. Yeah. And Saudi Arabia's cost of getting a barrel of oil, no one knows, but it's probably less than $10. I think their view is they're going to be the last guy selling oil on the planet because it's always going to be so cheap from them.
Has the largest oil, right?
The fracking revolution, is it now bigger than Saudi Arabia? It might be. It's in the neighborhood if it's not. Yeah. And that's all due to, I'm going to talk about this later, hydraulic fracturing. It kind of, US production was going down, and then this hydraulic fracturing happened. Okay, so in principle, there's nothing wrong with all this, except now we're going to talk about the two painful externalities associated with fossil fuels. And the first one is air pollution, and that causes people to lead in the much shorter and sicker lives. And so I'm going to try and convince you of that if you're not already convinced. Here's a count of the number of people on the planet who live in places where air pollution concentrations exceed the WHO standard. So in China, it's 1.4 billion. In India, it's 1.3 billion, and you can see all the other countries listed here. But almost 6 billion people on the planet. I'm not sure the WHO standard is the right standard, but it's one way to summarize this. Almost all of that particulates pollution, that's a really nasty one to keep your eye on, comes from energy consumption one way or another. And so why should you think that there is any problem with using with air pollution caused by particulates? So that was a question I've been working on for probably 2 decades now. There's a lot of research on what happens on very polluted days, or what happens on a very polluted season, or what happens in a very polluted year. But that's not really why we care about air pollution. We care about long-term exposure. And so it's a little bit like asking, a lot of the work has had the flavor of, did you smoke a cigarette today? Did you die today? But what you really want to know is, If you smoke a cigarette for 50 years, what does that do to your life expectancy? And so that seemed like a very intractable question. A lot of my work is using randomized control trials. No university in their right mind will ever let me run a randomized control trial where I put one set of people in clean air for their whole life and another set of people in dirty air for their whole life, and then and see what happens to them. So I felt like the literature was a little bit stuck. And then one day I learned about this policy that China started back in the planning period. And wrote a couple of papers about it. This is a more recent one, which I feel like was a good natural experiment for trying to infer what the long-run consequences of high levels, exposure to high levels of particulates were. So let me just describe the policy. China had, back in the planning period, when it was a much poorer country, didn't have enough money to provide winter heating for everyone. So they did something that was probably totally seemingly sensible at the time, also pretty arbitrary and capricious, so that's good for research, which is they drew a line across the middle of the country. That line follows this river, the Huai River, and they said, if you live north of the line, then we're going to give you free winter heating. We're going to build you boilers for every apartment building and every government building, not like big power stations, but crappy the small boilers. And we're going to give you free coal from roughly November 15th to March 15th. And it depends exactly where you are in China, but in Beijing, it's the States. And you're going to have all the heat you can possibly use in that period. In contrast, if you live south of the line, you are out of luck. There will be no heating. There's no coal. There's no boilers. There's no nothing. And so like when I've given lectures in the northern part of the South in the winter in China in rooms like this, the students are all wearing winter coats. And they're wearing winter coats because there's no heating. And so like the legacy of that policy it carries on. Even today. So here's the line. This is the river. Eventually it runs into a mountain range. And so the whole idea is to compare places that are just to the north versus just to the south. And when I learned about that, I thought, whoa, this is kind of what we've been looking for. Something that causes long-run exposures to vary, not year-to-year or day-to-day exposures to vary. A lot of this occurred during, and it's less true now, but a lot of this occurred during a period when migration was heavily limited or restricted in China. And so if I saw a person living somewhere today, I could have some confidence that they had been there most of their life. And so are people familiar with regression discontinuity designs? Okay, so the idea was to have a regression discontinuity design in geography where you're comparing people born just to the north and just to the south. This is just to illustrate they did not do this in like a way where thinking about reducing or controlling pollution was a big deal. They put very inefficient boilers attached to each building, and you can see with no environmental controls on them. So the whole paper boils down to two figures, and my favorite papers boil down to one or two figures. Let me explain what this one is. 0 here is the line, and then I'm going to take geographic areas that are 1 degree latitude displacements of the line. So the red circle are people who live, and the circles are proportional to the population, people who live within 1 degree latitude north of the line. The second one is people who live 1 to 2 degrees north, 2 to 3, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then on the blue ones are people who live 1 degree, 0 to 1 degree latitude south, 1 to 2 degrees south, et cetera, et cetera. And what I want you to take or see is that there's this very sharp jump in exposure to pollution just as you cross the line. That shouldn't be terribly surprising given the policy, but as someone who has been disappointed, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, by data over and over in my life, this was, I think, a quite striking figure. So is this track?
why did you use degrees and not kilometers?
Oh, you could do it either way. I think, locally it doesn't matter. Obviously if you're the equator versus the North Pole, then it does matter. But and in the regressions, it doesn't matter what flexible form you use.
Content of this pole.
We don't have great measures of it. We don't have great measures of it. Okay, so what's are you trying to? So okay, this is an important question. Am I going to argue that all of the north is identical to all of the south? Maybe that's your question. No, I'm not going to argue that. So the power of the regression discontinuity design is you're forcing all the comparisons right there, and you're looking for discrete changes at the line. There's, through a series of variables, which I will not bore you with here, we were unable to find any evidence of discrete changes. We're also unable to find evidence of any discrete jumps in pollution at any other latitude displacements we drew a fake line here and said, well, is there a discrete jump there? And there's no discrete jump there. And so that's like the power of the regression discontinuity design, is you're really forcing the comparisons right there. And there's not the river doesn't divide provinces or cities or anything like that.
The fact that the circles to the south, especially close to zero, are much larger, is that evidence of spillovers?
The fact that the circles are
To the left of zero,
yeah.
kind of large, is that evidence of spillovers because they don't have any boilers, right? So
I don't think it's evidence of spillovers. Yeah, I guess they are. I mean, I don't think it's evidence of spillovers. And I should mention, the pollution levels are very, very high, even to the south too. And then here, and this is PM10, not 2.5. So you're getting about a 40% jump. Was there?
It was similar. So if you remove observations that are very close to the river on either side, does this become bigger, the discontinuity, or does it attenuate?
Oh, I'm sorry. Now I understand. Pollution spillovers. Sorry, I understand the question now. Yes, there's no doubt. And you could try to remove them. You can do it with your eye. I guess it doesn't become much bigger. Yes, for sure there's some. And let me say, I don't need for this study, I don't need an iron wall that prevents pollution from crossing. I just need a discrete jump.
So was migration taken into account?
So this was a period where there was pretty restricted, but regardless, I tied people to where they grew up, which was almost always the same as where they were now. Yes, absolutely. Again, this is I'm not going to get to run the perfect experiment here. But what is appealing, particularly with the first study, was that was before people could really migrate in China. And if I saw someone in a place, I kind of knew that they were there for most of their life. But I'm not denying this is not a perfect petri dish where we put people. Okay. So the second one is what happened to life expectancy. And here you see this very sharp drop in life expectancy among the intended beneficiaries of this policy. It's about 3 years. And then this is to the question of the spillovers. Once I have this, again, it doesn't matter if there's spillovers as long as there's this jump. And once I have this, I can divide one by the other. And I can then form an estimate of what an extra 10 micrograms per cubic meter of PM10 does to life expectancy. Does that make sense? Okay. So I did that, and I created something called the Air Quality Life Index, and that there's actually English, Hindi, and Mandarin versions of it. It's on the, it's a website there now, and what it allows people to do is to zoom into any part of the world. And here, this is reporting the change in life expectancy if your area, region, I think for India it goes on the district level, comes into compliance with WHO standards. You can also set it so that it's what if you come into compliance with Indian standards or whatever country you happen to be focusing on. And this is, the aim of this was like, I find AQI super frustrating. Like I can never remember if brown is better than orange is better than purple. And it doesn't really tell you what it means for your life. And just that, directionally more is bad. And so this was meant to kind of be an antidote to that by converting, based on the Swai River papers, the changes in pollution into changes in life expectancy. Okay.
Is there a dose response embedded in that?
Yes. So it's very important question. So the dose response is this divided by the other one. And so I'm assuming linearity. And what is true is there's support in the data from the Chinese data for a very wide range of PM10, maybe not all the way down to the very low levels that prevail in like in Western Europe or in the United States, but there's support in the data for a very wide range. I think what is the exact functional form? You're gonna have to have two experiments or more than one experiment for that because you have more than one parameter you have to identify. But what I would say that I think is important to take away from it is actually most of the weight of the data is at the very high concentrations that prevail in India and prevail in China and other places. And so where I feel like not on very solid footing is extrapolating to very low levels, but at the high levels, you're estimating the same range of data that people are breathing. It's a very good and important question though. Here it is in India, if you take these estimates literally with this linear dose response function, the average person would live, by getting to the national standards, live about 2 more years, getting to WHO standards would live about 5 more years. And obviously in the northern belt, those numbers are even higher. The average person on the planet would live about 2 years longer if the whole world were brought into compliance with WHO standards. That's more than getting rid of smoking or alcohol and drug use or unsafe water. And the main thing I just want to highlight is like, I think this is like this does not receive enough attention. This is, I think, is the greatest external threat to human well-being on the planet. And it's not that some of these other things are unimportant, but because it's kind of invisible, we don't give it as much attention as it deserves. Okay. That was a long. Before we move on, any other questions about that? Yeah. Along the river. No, there's no discrete change. No discrete change.
The linear dose response. I mean,
My understanding was that there's some concavity at very high levels.
Okay.
I mean, again, we had a talk here a couple of months ago, which tried to show some concavity. in
Yes.
that.
Okay. So why do I think that concavity is there? I think the concavity is there because that is being argued by people who've estimated the health effects at very low levels and kind of feel uncomfortable if you took that slope and applied it everywhere.
Yes.
And so they say, well, it must even out. I don't really have a dog in a fight about what the functional form is at low levels. What I do is where I have a dog in the fight is I have data at super high levels. Those guys don't have data at super high levels. And I'm just reporting what that data says.
So that's your Chinese data, right?
Yeah, that's the Chinese data. So it's this issue of the functional form is not a trivial one because you end up with these very large numbers. But those guys have no data at the high levels. And so, they're making it up as far as I can tell.
Okay.
And not with bad intentions. It's just, there's no data. So when you have no data, you have to make assumptions, and their assumptions concavity. I'm telling you that I got data. So it's an important point though. One other thing I want to say about this, I am working on a paper, it's not public, that looks at the impacts on human capital accumulation. This is not for people who die, this is for people who live. And what I find with the same research design is that the people who were born in China to the north, again, regression discontinuity design, discrete change, are getting about a year less of education by the time they're an adult. It's an enormous amount. It's almost impossible to think of an educational policy that moves in any direction, up or down, a year of education. And I can show what their earnings are as they're adults, and it looks like they're earning maybe 13 to 15% less. And so that would imply, if you took those numbers literally, that by only focusing on health, we've been understating the full effects of air pollution by about 50%. Okay. Population.
That's why I think migration is something that you should take into account while.
Yeah, and so again, an advantage of, so I'm assigning people to where they were born. So if you think that they were all migrating once they turned 25 to the south because it's cleaner, then I'm gonna and so that they don't have the full lifetime exposure, then I'm gonna be understating the effects. But most of this is estimated in a period where there was very restrictive migration in China.
So another question. So given this discontinuous change in the north has heating and the south doesn't, would that in any way lead to also discontinuous change in which in the ways in which the elderly are taken care of? Because that would directly affect life expectancy, in the way society is organized, nuclear families, joint families, what kind of care is given to the elderly?
And so your idea is all the young people left the north and left the old people to die by themselves or something?
I'm asking.
Yeah, so we just don't see those discontinuities I have not been able to see discontinuities in that, in population counts or demographic group counts. It's just not in the data. Yeah.
Are you also controlling for the positive effects of eating on?
Yeah, so the question, which is a good one, is wait a minute. You have a discontinuous change in pollution, but you also have a discontinuous change in heating. So I think that would mean we're probably understating the effects of air pollution if you think heating is a plus in the winter, which I think it probably is. Okay, all right, we might not get past this one.
Perhaps related to Shramindu's question, I was just wondering about heterogeneities on the education result. So is it that richer people in the areas with heating are in fact able to overcome those disadvantages because of access to these resources, or they also suffer these losses?
Sorry, say the question one more time.
So people in the areas with heating, richer people, are they able to overcome those disadvantages?
Oh, so I don't have the data to pick that apart. So the question is, are the rich protected from this? And I don't have the data to pick that apart.
If not in this study, in general, in air pollution is differential and sort of recent good, but does the data?
We haven't really had the data. Let's not kid ourselves. Like the rich are better off on every dimension. Correct. Okay. So, you know, who owns the air purifiers today in Delhi? It's not the poor. And so, yeah, there's all kinds of self-protective behavior that people engage in. And air pollution, self-protection against air pollution is surely something that is, when you walk around Delhi, you know that that's true. So, and by the way, that would be yet a further cost of air pollution. All the wasted expenditure on the, not wasted, but the expenditures that go towards self-protection that could otherwise go to something else. Okay, we are going to get through this whole talk.
Just a higher population, because more population density can also impact life expectancy.
Yeah, they do. I just don't. There's in the data that I know visually it's looking like something, but there's just not evidence of discontinuities in any of those variables. And again, I'm not comparing all the north to all the south. It's by the river that I'm comparing. Okay. Yeah. Okay. We could spend a long time there. Okay. The sixth fact is fossil fuels are causing climate change. And I couldn't come up with a pithy way to say this, and its projected impacts are large and heterogeneous. And so we'll talk more about this later today. This is, I think, this is from some work I'm doing with Robin Burgess and Dave Donaldson and Olivier Deschênes, comparing, and this is going to be really important. Let's go back to the main thesis that I have here about the global energy challenge. This is comparing the impacts of when a hot day arrives in the United States. We'll start with that, and you can see that what this exercise is using 35 million death records. The exercise I want you to think about is what happens if we take a day 70 to 74 Fahrenheit and swap it to very hot. You can see that there is a change in the log annual mortality rate. And this is kind of statistical noise that it goes back down, but you should just think of this as moving back up. You can see hotter days increase annual mortality rates. All right, now I'm going to do something very, very tricky, but it's actually okay. I'm just going to stretch out the y-axis. Okay, it's going to be the same blue line, but I'm going to stretch out the y-axis. So that's the same blue line. Why did I stretch out the y-axis? Because I'm going to put the response function for India on this same axis, okay? And I had to stretch it out to fit it. And so when you do that, this is what happens when a hot day arrives to India. So first of all, let's just focus on the US for 1 second. You can see daily temperatures basic. Yes, they go up, the mortality rate goes up a little bit, but in some global context, if you live in the US, you're basically protected from temperatures, and that's because there's all kinds of heating and cooling and things like that. In India, when a hot day comes, it's devastating in terms of mortality. Like the impact is maybe 20 to 25 times larger. No, that's it's the average daily temperature. It's the average of the high and the low. Nothing about humidity. No, what? Yes, yeah. Now I want to attach this to what I was talking about before. Remember, the non-fossil fuels are probably in many parts of the world 3, 4, 5 times more expensive. So if you think we're going to do something about climate change, you're effectively saying, hey, we should buy electricity or buy cars that cost more. Now hold that thought. Now we have this. Okay, so the red line is horrible, right? The red line is like, this is data, but these are like actual real life human beings who are dying and being sick and leading very complicated lives. Well, what's the best way to get off the redlining to get onto the blue line? That's to grow. And what is the best way not to spend 3 to 5 times as much on electricity or on sources of energy. And so now I want you to begin to see like the tension here, which, this is, I don't think it's completely novel to people in this room, but there is this tension here. Like if we're going to do something globally about climate change, effectively, the red line is being asked to buy more expensive energy. Maybe the blue line is as well. But at the very same time that the more expensive energy is so desperately needed to get rid of that terrible response function, the red one. Is that tracking? Okay. And that's part of the climate challenge, I think, is so desperately complicated. So this is today. What happens if we go out into the future? One thing that I have found very frustrating, and we'll talk a lot about this later today, is how people talk about the cost of climate change, being a 2% change in GDP, global GDP or something. Well, like nobody lives at the global average. They live in particular places. And so this is taking some work of mine with a series of collaborators and estimating what the impacts of the change in temperature are going to be kind of location by location for 20,000 locations around the world. And two that really stick out are Oslo. So you take Oslo, they have terrible winters. And so what climate change is going to do is going to get rid of those terrible winters, which do kill a lot of people. And they're pretty rich. And their summers aren't so hot. And so they're not going to get lots of days that kill people. And so you can see there's this very large projected, very large reduction in mortality that's going to happen in Oslo. If you go to Accra, by contrast, which is already hot and not very wealthy, you can see that there's this projected very large increase in mortality in Accra. And of course, you can see the different regions in India and the different regions in China and et cetera, et cetera. And you can see these, giant swatches of land where it's going to be blue, Canada and Russia, where blue is reductions, but nobody lives there to a first approximation. And so the problem, what I see is, one way to handle climate change, obviously, would be that there's billions and billions of people in the red zone for those guys to go to the blue zone. And in a world that didn't have lines on it, which we call borders, that might actually be a reasonable solution. But I think at this point, the world has come to understand migration is very, very complicated and very, very fraught politically. And it's not the case that like 500 million Indians are going to move here in a very peaceful way, and I'm not even saying they would want to, but if they did want to, that seems very unlikely to me. And so what I want you to take away from this is the impacts of climate change are very heterogeneous, and they're actually heterogeneous in a way that is not going to make dealing with climate change, it's going to make it dealing with it even harder than if the impacts were distributed equally around the planet. I think we can skip that. Okay, so here we'll try to just end the facts, and I'm going to come, my kids yell at me. They came to this one time and say that this is way too gloomy and that I have to have solutions. So there's going to be some solutions coming in a few minutes. But we'll just end with the climate challenge is substantial. So here's where we are. Before the Paris Agreement, the world was on track for end of 21st century of somewhere between 4 to 5 degrees C increase. The pledges in Paris, you could say we're putting the world on track for maybe about a 2 degree C change. Those are pledges, they're not binding. Countries are having a hard time meeting their pledges. Here's where the scientists think we should end up is 1.5 degrees. I don't actually think there's anything magical about 1.5 degrees. I find it kind of annoying, but that nevertheless, that's what they say. And this is probably where the world is right now. There's a lot of guesswork that goes into this, obviously going out to end of the century. So you could kind of view this as half full, half empty. So definitely some progress has been made, but we're definitely on a path for lots and lots of climate change. I find this useful. Like, what would it take actually to get to 2 degrees C. And so this is the path the world has been on in emissions. We're probably at 40 billion metric tons of CO2 annually right now. And you can see it's just been marching up and up. That's like, these aren't projections, that's real data, historical data. Well, what would it take to go to 2 degrees C? Well, if you started in 2022, you'd have to have this very sharp reduction. Obviously, there's nothing in the data saying that that's coming. You know, if you started a year later, it would have to become sharper and sharper. And this is just giving you, just to give you a sense of like what the 2 degree target really would require of the world. I tried to put this together. Where is India on its commitments? So this is, these are the, so here to here is real data. And these are the NDC commitments from India. Current policies are probably, there's some gap between the current commitments. This is where the US is relative to its commitments. Before the Inflation Reduction Act, the US was nowhere near on track. The Inflation Reduction Act was passed this summer, was projected to have a substantial impact, although leaves the US short of what, certainly short of what it promised to do in the Paris Agreement. Okay, I think this is a really important couple slides coming up. These are 2019 pre-COVID, how many tons per person. So India is like 1.7. The US is almost 16. There's China and the EU somewhere in between. Obviously, that disparity is, you know, amazing. Here's the where the US and Europe are on emissions through about 2020, dating back to 1980. This is where China is. So the dotted lines are the projections. And it's only easy to go out to about 2050. And this is where India is. And what I want you to take away from this is, even though the historical contribution, obviously the US is an enormous outlier on that. And in current consumption, the US has very high levels, and Europe and China have very high levels. There is just like super painful math, which is, what this means is that today's emerging economies, I haven't put sub-Saharan Africa on here, are projected to account for a very high fraction of emissions going forward. And so without making any statement about who's paying for it, restraining climate change is going to have to require reductions in CO2 emissions from today's emerging economies. And again, that's where like the pain of solving the climate problem really lives, is the very places that are, for very good reasons, anxious and desperate to have a lot more energy consumption, are in one, if the world is to confront climate change, are being asked to purchase more expensive energy that is non-fossil fuels. And there's an incredible...
This is not a population adjusted picture.
This is what?
This is the absolute carbon emission.
I understand that. And that's actually a point I want to make. So that's why I started by showing this. This is a very important point. He's saying, wait a minute, you should be dividing by population. Yes. And what I'm saying is, maybe that's right in some moral way. The planet doesn't care. The planet is not going to divide by people. The planet only cares about tons of CO2. And I'm choosing my words very carefully here. I'm not saying who should pay. That's a very different question. I'm saying that algebra is, there's no confronting climate change without large reductions in today's emerging economies. Maybe the US should pay, maybe Europe should pay, maybe China should pay. I'm not saying anything about that. I'm saying just the raw math is, if you don't reduce emissions here, and you don't reduce emissions in China, and you don't reduce emissions in sub-Saharan Africa, in the very places where those fossil fuels are needed the most, for all the reasons I articulated, There's going to be no really tackling climate change. That's you tracking my argument?
Yeah, I agree with that. But if this picture is shown to the audience, then it will show a disproportionate burden on India and China. That's the point.
That is the point.
Yeah. So
Those are but
what is the
that's my
context
point,
is
not
under-
your point. No, my point is that these are places where the need for more energy is enormous. And for all the reasons I articulated. And yet there's the climate change isn't dividing by anything. It just counts tons. So I'm very intentionally trying to not dive into who should pay for what. That's a different question.
To continue to play the devil's advocate here, why is it not possible for the linear monotonic relationship between carbon emissions and growth to turn negative because of technological change, and which means that the US and Europe can also decrease emissions without compromising growth?
So the reason it's not possible is today is because the fossil fuels are less expensive. If we have some innovative breakthrough, so the climate problem is the delta between the cost of the fossil fuels and non-fossil fuels. If that flipped, there's nothing to talk about anymore. The climate problem goes away. And so that's that delta that's making this so painful. The technology is the delta. And the problem is the technology right now is that the fossil fuels are cheaper. So tomorrow, if the renewables go to zero and they get magically their intermittency problem goes away and batteries become very cheap, there's nothing to talk about. That it would be a happy state of the world. We have a parade. Okay. So I'm going to try to end on time. What are the solutions that we have available? So I think this has worked. I've gotten there are a couple solutions. One, we are setting up our energy markets in ways that are causing this problem because we're letting polluters off for free. If you put particulates in the air, basically you don't have to pay for it. You put CO2 in the air, basically you don't have to pay for it. So imagine a world where we structured our energy markets where as if everyone paid attention to economics, which of course they should, and externalities were priced at their full cost. Well, what happened? So here's the graph we looked at a while ago, just flipped on its side. This is the cost of an existing coal plant, 2.8 cents a kilowatt hour, new coal plant, natural gas cycle plant, and a new coal plant. Now I'm going to just put in the renewables with the natural gas backup and the renewables with the battery backup. These are the same numbers you saw before. Now, what I'm going to start to do is I'm going to start to price externalities, and we're going to see how the playing field changes. So with the green one, if you put in a social cost of carbon that is of about $200, which is, we're going to talk about this later today, I'm going to argue that that's about the right price given current research. It's like a complete game changer. Nobody in their right mind would ever produce electricity with coal, be it in old plant or new plant. Nobody would use natural gas. Nuclear, which looked like a technology that's basically dead, would suddenly be in the money. You would have some of these renewables with natural gas backup, including paying the penalty for the natural gas backup, would start to look like they were competitive. And you would even see some of the battery, at least wind onshore, would be competitive. Now, what happens if we add in the health costs, monetizing the health costs of air pollution? I mean, you can see like coal is like, you just can't imagine anyone in their right mind would ever want to use coal in that setup. It would go the way of whale oil, which we used to use. So, you know, what is one solution? It's a blackboard economic solution, but it's a blackboard economic solution with a very, very large impacts on human well-being, which is just price externalities. We talk about that all the time. Well, here I'm just price externalities. It would totally upend our energy systems in different ways, and we would have a very different world than the world we have right now. I think in the interest of time, I'm not going to spend time on this. Just note, the world's doing a crappy job pricing carbon. The average price in carbon around the world, including all the places where it's unpriced, is probably about $5. I think that's 1/40th of what it should be. It should be about $200. In the interest of time, we're going to skip this. Skip this. Oh, one pushback on carbon policy is it's going to hurt the poor. And carbon pricing is going to hurt the poor. That is a design feature. You can design carbon policy, carbon pricing, where you take in revenues and you rebate them to the poor, and you can have that the poor are actually better off. This is data from the United States. You could do the same exercise in other parts of the world. Innovation. So, whoa, do we need some innovation? We got to get rid of that delta. That delta is crushing us. And so there's, I should end on time. Yes. So I'm not going to go into great detail about this. This is based on some work that I did with Rohini and Esther Duflo and Nick Ryan in Gujarat, showing that oftentimes the policies that we have on the books don't deliver the results we would like them to have, and that they can be reformed in ways that produce improvements in environmental quality. And this is just one example of that from the state of Gujarat on a policy that we tested with the Gujarat Pollution Control Board and has proved to be successful at reducing emissions, and now has been scaled up with policy throughout the state. And here's a quote from Hardik Shah, who at the time was the member secretary of the Gujarat Pollution Control Board. Given some of the questions, I'm going to focus on technical innovation because I think there was a lot of interest in that. So we have had a good amount of innovation, not enough, but in the last decade, there's been quite remarkable reductions in the cost of batteries, so large that they were, you couldn't have imagined them 10 years ago. This is reductions in solar, more modest reductions in the price of wind. And all the numbers I've shown you are after those reductions. We need more reductions. But what I want to emphasize is it's not enough to have reductions in the non-fossils. And here is hydraulic fracturing, a little cartoon showing what hydraulic fracturing is, which is a way to recover natural gas and oil that was pioneered in the United States. And it's just worth taking 1 second to point out the way they did it. So the usual way is you go down, you find a pool of oil and natural gas, and you suck it out, kind of like a milkshake. But everyone knew for a very long period of time, there was this layer of rock called shale, where there was just very rich in fossil fuels, but it was so dense, people thought that there was no way that we would ever get there and get the fossil fuels out of there in an economically sensible way. What these guys figured out is how to get the drill to go down 6,000 or 7,000, 8,000 feet, then make a right turn at 90 degrees. Just think about that. That's not easy. Then go out a while, and then shoot like fluids, which they still don't really admit what's in them, into the shale rock to open it up, and then the natural gas and the oil start to flow out. So that was kind of a massive achievement. But then they noticed that there was a decline very quickly, and that's because the fissures in the rock that they had created started to close. And so then they were like, oh, what should we do? And then they figured out, well, they put it in sand in this unknown fluid that they inserted there. The sand would keep the fissures open longer. And that's a way to get more oil and natural gas out. So the reason I'm belaboring this is that the innovation we need in the non-fossils, there has to be a lot of it, but it has to be more than what these guys are going to do. because these guys are going to keep trying. And without, you have to jump over them, not just have improvements. That's the point I want to make. These guys are very, very smart and very, very crafty. And there's shale deposits all over the world, by the way. And to the date, they've primarily been used in North America, but the idea that they will not be used in other parts of the world strikes me as somewhat wishful thinking. You know, what's a solution to that? A solution to that is to spend a lot more on energy R&D. I think we don't spend nearly enough. So that's a second market failure. The first is non-pricing. The second is we're not spending enough on basic research to help shrink that delta. And so that's a second solution. That one is pretty feasible. A third one is, and I thought this was all kind of goofy and unlikely to amount to much, is okay. Yeah. So third one, I'll finish. Yeah, I'll even finish with time for one or two questions. Was in the United States, and I think in other countries, in the last 2, maybe 3 years, there's been this giant push from people and employees and suppliers that I think is born of frustration from governments' failures, that the organizations they work for, that they do business with, should do something about their carbon footprint. And so I used to think this was kind of just all greenwashing, but I'm now beginning to think that there is something happening there in what I would call the voluntary carbon market, where organizations reduce their carbon footprint, not because government is mandating them to, but because they find it, they just want to, or they find it necessary to satisfy some of their stakeholders. And the one further accelerant to that is that the United States seems poised, we'll find out next month or two, to require all public companies to report their emissions of CO2. And then once that happens, you could imagine that there starts to be benchmarking, you know, hey, why did your emissions go up this year relative to your peers? And that would eventually start to lead to pressure for these kinds of voluntary actions. I'll just highlight, so I would say you can see a voluntary market trying to form with lots of demand piling up. All these companies saying they're going to be net zero this, net zero that by 2030, 2050, whatever it is. The supply side, I think, still remains pretty bad. And there's now a 25 years, starting with the Clean Development Mechanism, 25-year history of these kinds of offset projects that are ways to satisfy that demand, often like clean cook stove programs or tree programs that have failed to deliver the promised reductions in CO2. And so I think whether or not that voluntary carbon market really takes hold is going to depend on having some real innovation on the supply side so that these kinds of exposés are no longer written. And I started an NGO called Climate Vault that is trying to do some of that disruption on the supply side. I think in the interest of time, we won't go through all that. And I'm going to end with where I started, which is, which hopefully will be a frame over the next 2 talks later today on the global energy challenge. And I think every society around the world is struggling with this, which is how to find a way to balance the need for inexpensive and reliable energy while managing local environmental problems associated with energy consumption and without setting off disruptive climate change. And so if you leave with anything, I want you to leave with the idea there's not a climate problem in isolation. There's not an energy problem in isolation. There's not a pollution problem in isolation. They're all interconnected and involve these trade-offs amongst them. So I'd be happy to answer any questions for a few minutes.
Wonderful. So I don't know if we'll meet our carbon budget, but you did meet the time budget and you finished 2 minutes earlier. So I think we have time for a few questions since we did start 10 minutes late. So our tea break starts at 11, but I'll allow about 5 minutes of questions. So please ask very specific questions if you have any. raise your hand. Yes, Sandeep, yeah.
I want to, can you elaborate a bit on the link between the Inflation Reduction Act and the reduction in the emissions? What's the link between that? Why was that?
Oh, why did the Inflation Reduction Act, reduce emissions?
Right.
Why is it projected to? Yeah. It's, well, that's like a little political marketing. It's called the Inflation Reduction Act, but it's really a climate bill.
It's just
It subsidizes the cost of renewables.
some sort of log rolling, right? Or
Yeah. So that was to get the key 50th vote in the Senate from Senator Joe Manchin from West Virginia. It had to be called that.
So when you were showing the cost of battery versus the price of oil, right? So, but and this is in reference to the transportation sector, but once you buy a car, then you have to incur the cost of filling the oil is a recurring cost that you have to incur throughout the lifetime that you own the car. But I'm guessing to recharge the batteries pretty cheap. So I didn't really quite get the why it would be cheaper to still opt for oil, because that's a recurring investment.
So if I understood the question right, I think the question is, hey, did I account for the cost of electricity? Yes, it's all embedded in there. So, but the thing where you can imagine big changes is in the cost of the battery. And so that's why I focused on that.
does it also include the disposal costs of the batteries?
Okay, so that's a very controversial question. It's a great question. It does not include the disposal costs of the batteries. And there's two competing views on that. One is that they'll have some economic value and you can sell them for something. The second one is they're very expensive to dispose of environmentally. And if that second answer is the right one, that's going to shift this curve higher and make the full-scale acceptance of EVs further out in the future.
So since you come to Delhi often, if you just step outside, you'll see this e-rickshaws, which is the informal sector. And the way that they recycle the lead is absolutely awful. So,
okay, so
it's an informal market in those lead batteries.
Yeah.
So exactly your line will shift way up.
Yep.
If you look at the environmental costs of the disposal of the lead and the recycling of the lead, and lead being an accumulative toxin. So, so all that stuff is not being talked about because the government is really enthusiastic about.
The battery manufacturers or advocates say, oh, they can be resold and repurposed, but
But these are batteries coming from China and wherever, and just totally in the informal sector.
Yeah.
And we all use these e-rickshaws. Other questions? Sandeep, you have maybe if somebody else has a question, Shivangi, right? Aapke piche wahan there's a question.
So you were not very enthusiastic about nuclear energy being an alternative, but France is a country which has over 70% of its energy being powered by nuclear, and they've been able to considerably reduce their pollutions of different particles. So why do you think that's something that other parts of the world can't follow?
So, so at the end of the talk, yes, if you're going to have markets that don't price externalities, nuclear looks very expensive. That's all. If you price externalities, nuclear looks great.
About pricing externalities related to nuclear, do you price in the cost of disposing the nuclear waste also?
I can't, honestly, I can't quite tell. This is from using U.S. Department of Energy Information Administration numbers. I can't quite tell if the full cost of disposal's in there or not. So it's a very fair question.
And words like Chernobyl come to mind, and Zaporizhia.
Okay, but let me push back on that. I know people say that about nuclear. The ratio of people who have died from coal plants to nuclear accidents is, it's 1 million to 1, 10,000 to 1. So, and I understand they don't die in this horrific, immediate ways, but they do die.
Yes, of course.
And so our willingness to accept slow, quiet deaths from air pollution from coal plants, and unwillingness to accept, one in,
Yeah, it's the child falling in the well syndrome, right?
Yeah,
So you
yeah,
won't
yeah.
spend.
yes.
Way back, Naveen, you have a mic, please? Yeah, just. Moshmi, you've gone far back.
Yeah, I have a sort of a related question that when you calculate this cost, so is it the average cost spread over fixed and variable cost? Because some of this could be a lot of fixed costs going into the green energy, but low variable cost.
Yeah, so this is the average cost over the lifetime of a plant. But remember, you do, in the moment, you don't have to meet average cost, but you're not going to build these plants if you can't meet.
Yeah, but that means that there's scope for the government to come in and eventually it might get better because it's a fixed cost. Is that possible?
Okay, so Rakesh.
Hi. So since pricing externality seems to be the, important part of the solution. So according to you, what is the most significant hurdle in implementing?
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah. And why don't more people listen to economists? Isn't this a conference of people who wish they were listened to more? I tried to pick on one of them. People hold up the distributional issue. I think that's a total red herring, because you can design the pricing of externalities to protect lower income people.
Taxation seems to be the only way in which
Taxation, cap and trade, the same thing.
Other questions?
I don't have a good answer to it's so in the United States, it's politically toxic. Look, India just passed a bill this week that said they're going to have a carbon market. The United States doesn't have one.
Okay, so Garima and then Shomendu, and then one last question. Going on. So just two last questions. Yeah.
You spoke about demand from citizens to implement better climate policy. And my understanding is that there's more support for this in richer countries as opposed to countries which perhaps are bearing the brunt of climate change in bigger ways. So do you think there's practical ways to build more of that demand side in these countries? How would we do that?
I think, well, we're going to talk about that more as the day goes on. So I guess I have two answers. One, it's the same fossil fuels that are causing air pollution today outside that door that are causing the climate change. And so I think there's a pretty good case for if it was only focused on air pollution, there would be tremendous climate co-benefits. And the first thing you do if you're really narrowly focused on air pollution is you go after coal, I think. It's just devastatingly bad in terms of externalities. And there's so a different answer is looking at, let's just talk, we're in India, so talk. Pretty hot, not a super rich place. It's not Dubai. It's not going to have personal air conditioners or something like that. Have you seen these pictures of the shirts with air conditioners built into them? That's not coming for most people anytime soon. And I think taking account of how the damages from climate change are going to be distributed and unfairly distributed disproportionately in India, I think that could be the base for making an argument about climate change.
Okay, Shomendu has one question.
It's related to this slide.
Yeah.
So the concern about climate change is like more recent. If we look at long run data, in this context, do you see people migrating in response to climate change?
From trying to say the blue is a great place to migrate to countries.
Okay, so
and I'm not saying everyone would want to migrate, but would be some people who would like to, and it's very, very hard to do that across borders.
So in the interest of collegiality, we have somebody from the Institute of Economic Growth here, Chetan. So, and he said he'll ask a political economy question. So I use my prerogative to.
So you didn't talk about carbon capture technologies as a possible solution and their cost. Is it pie in the sky, or is it something that is possibly effective?
Yeah, so the enemy delta, and so we have to shrink the delta. So I don't know if you mean carbon capture at the end of the smokestack, or if you really mean carbon dioxide removal.
Yeah,
carbon dioxide removal. Okay, so let's just to clarify, the question is, what about carbon dioxide removal technologies which say, hey, there's already this CO2 in the atmosphere, can we pull it out? We should be spraying money at that, in my view, and turning over cards and hoping we get lucky.
And second quick question is that
it would be a game changer.
Yeah. If the carbon tax route is politically hard to do, Biden, the Inflation Reduction Act is going the spending route. Is that the more politically acceptable way to
In the United States?
In the United States, maybe even here?
Well, so one thing I want to point out is, well, so first of all, India now has passed legislation to have a cap and trade for carbon. So like, hooray. So India seems like it's going to be on the path to having some kind of pricing policy. Details TBD. But the United States, I just don't think there's a path in the long run that doesn't run through carbon pricing. Yeah, you can make incremental gains. They're going to be expensive. People's desire to have pay for expensive tons, I think, is not limitless. And at the end, I really don't believe it's going to be feasible to make very large reductions in emissions without that. You know, most of the emissions reductions drove coal out of is driving out of the system. Natural gas has half the carbon content. It was not policy that did it. So driving coal out is super effective. But once you've done it, then you're stuck with natural gas, or you have natural gas. There's a great line about natural gas. So, you know, it's blue. Is it the long blue bridge, green future? Or is it a long bridge?
Okay, thank you. I started by saying that Michael is the quintessential scholar practitioner, and I think we have seen adequate evidence of that. So thank you, Michael, for this very, very interesting stage setter for the next two talks that are to follow. And I can see Moshmi will make her usual logistical announcements, right?
Yeah, so tea and coffee is being served outside. Please join us. And then, but you know, you have about 15 minutes for the next session. So
It's from your tea budget.
so come back here sharp at 11:30, please. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
हेलो हेलो इस साइड में इस तरीके से मैं क्या टॉक करूँगा बात करूँगा तो देखना इसकी जब आपका कॉलर का ये नीचे आ जाता है ना आगे रखा हुआ था ना मतलब साउंड बढ़ा दें गेन बढ़ा दें
Okay, so should we start? Yeah, so okay. So welcome back to this second session. And Michael is already introduced to you, and to save the time. So in this session, Michael, I believe you are going to talk on local and global impacts of climate change.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so floor is yours.
Oh, wait, hold on. Let's. Otherwise it rubs against. Yes. Yeah. It's okay. Hmm.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, terrific. Okay, I'm gonna try and talk about some new research on the impacts of climate change, and also at the end talk about how that can be used to develop efficient policy responses to climate change. And a lot of this research is done through the Climate Impact Lab, which is a group that I helped set up maybe 7 or 8 years ago. And I should just say from the start, well, I guess we'll come to it, but oh. I should say from the start that the reason we set this up with my friends and collaborators, Solomon Chung, Bob Kopp, who's a climate scientist, and Trevor Hauser, was born of frustration that a lot of what was known about climate change and its impacts were kind of assumption driven and were from a period in time when we didn't really have access to data and we didn't have access to powerful computers. And our view was the world had changed, and now there was a possibility of having learning things with data and not just relying on kind of like unstructured debates about whether or not the relationship between damages and temperature change was quadratic or whether or not it was cubic, but really trying to use data to discipline what we were saying. So, you know, there's that old saw about giving a good talk, which is tell people what you're going to tell them the thing, and then tell them what you told them. So I'm going to try and stick to that here. Maybe I didn't do a good enough job of that last time. So the key takeaways here are that advances in economics and climate science allow for the quantification of both the global and local level impacts of climate change. What comes out of those exercises emerging is that damages are larger and more heterogeneous than we previously thought, some of which we saw in the last talk, and that costs are especially concentrated in today's hot and poor places. Okay, second thing that I want you to take away from this is an important way to summarize the damages from climate change are what are the impacts of the release of an additional ton of CO2 in terms of net damages. And the social cost of carbon is one way to do that. I think it's the most powerful. And so new social cost of carbon estimates suggest that current yearly emissions of carbon, of CO2, correspond to about $6.5 trillion of damages a year. So about, if we account it for the damages associated with all the carbon we use on the planet each year, and subtracted it off GDP, GDP would be about 8% lower. These new local damages and the social cost of carbon can be used to guide mitigation technologies. And then there was also, we had some discussion at the end of the last one about carbon dioxide removal. And we didn't talk about this, but even more science fiction-esque would be geoengineering, in particular solar radiation management. And so we're gonna try and pull all that together here. Oh, and again, the rule is if something is unclear or something's bothering you, you shouldn't sit on it. You should say it aloud and make this a conversation. Okay, so, you know, I do like pictures. Pictures are often really good ways to describe things. And I think part of this whole effort is to get off of talking about the 2% change or 5% change in global GDP, and instead really gain some resolution on what the impacts of climate change are in places that people actually live. And so here you can see the road melting. So that's a local impact. And I chose this provocatively as an alternative, or how climate change is felt in other parts of the world, which is, you know, here this person using air conditioning as a way to deal with high temperatures, and how disparate and how we might think of those. There's costs associated with both. These are obvious. This is higher electricity bills. Those are both costs. We might feel slightly differently about some of them than others. Okay, and in order to kind of develop rational policy, it's super important to understand what how much you should be willing to spend. And to do that, you're going to need estimates, I should say, global climate damages. The second is, if you're going to have reasonable adaptation policies, you have to know what it's going to be where people live, not in the average. And then there's these kind of new, we call them a third approach to confronting climate, carbon dioxide removal, and then geoengineering. Okay, so let's just begin with what did we know before we really tried to bring data to bear on this. And these are kind of canonical, this is a kind of canonical figure. It comes out of the interagency working group that I led when I was at the in the Obama administration. It was my idea that the US government should have a social cost of carbon. We set out to summarize the frontier of understanding. And the frontier of understanding came from these IAM models, integrated assessment models. And those models produced things like this, which were global damage functions. And this is the global change in global mean temperature. And this is the impact on GDP. And this is kind of what we had in 2010. It was kind of what we knew. And so it would lead to statements like this. The DICE model assumes 3 degrees warming would lower output by 1.5%, which I guess you can read off of here. A frustrating part of those IAMs is that there was not a lot of geographic resolution. The original one treated the whole world as one, so that was like, saying the North Pole would be the same as climate change would be in Bangladesh or somewhere else. And then there were more regional ones that developed 16, divide the world into 16 regions. I kind of think like that's like the slow boat to nowhere. And really, and I'll come to that in a second, what we needed to do was to rebuild this in a way where we could have much finer geographic resolution. And so what we did in the Climate Impact Lab, so first of all, you can see the studies that the IAMs were based on, most of them were published in the 1990s. Not surprising, that's when the IAMs were developed. And as a consequence, they missed what was an explosion of research on empirical research on what the impacts of climate change would be, or were going to be. That began maybe in the mid 2000s. I was certainly early to that. And there's now just like endless papers on various features of that. I feel like I missed a slide here. Oh, okay, it's coming. So sorry. And so what we're going to try and do is take the spirit of what is coming across in these individual studies and use them to develop more empirically founded estimates of climate change. Now I'm going to talk to you about how we try and do that. So we're calling this a new era for damage estimation. And I'm going to, we've been doing this sector by sector and then trying to pull all the sectors together. I'm going to walk through 3 of the sectors for you now. Just to give you a flavor of how we do it. And another thing that I really am going to try to emphasize that we do is climate change is uncertain, the impacts are uncertain. And we put great effort into trying to characterize that uncertainty. And then as one would, all of you know in this audience, it's, it's a safe space. It's a safe space because all of you guys know what to do with uncertainty and that you can value it from our kind of intermediate micro graph showing people dislike uncertainty and they're willing to pay insurance to avoid some of that uncertainty. And you can see that that's going to magnify, once you account for that, what the impacts of climate change are going to be. So let's just talk about what we were able to do with this Climate Impact Lab and getting much more geographic resolution. So the first thing we did is we divided the world into 25,000 regions. The aim there is to be able to say in Delhi, what are the impacts going to be versus what are going to be in Chicago versus Oslo, which we saw, and Accra. Here is, we're going to work our way back to this, but these are mean damages in 2100 as a percentage of GDP per capita around the world. And you can see how they're distributed, and they're distributed very unequally. This is before we were looking just at mortality. This is across all the sectors, but you can see there are these great big blue regions where there's no people. And in principle, those are going to become much easier places to live. And you can also see that the current distribution population around the world is not well suited to what's coming. Okay, so what were some of the, when we tried to set out on, that's the end. So how do we get there? We started with, we should try to use the best empirical evidence, use the best climate models, should be globally representative. It should account for adaptation and its costs. So adaptation is going to be super important way of confronting climate change, but it's not for free. It will reduce the costs, but we're going to have to pay something for it. That's the woman in front of the air conditioner. And that we want to be able to value the uncertainty and allow for that a $1 climate damage is is much more costly to a poor person in Bihar than it is to Elon Musk. And so some accounting for the marginal utility of income. Okay, and so we created this new model. We're horrible at naming things. You can see this is a terrible name. The Data-Driven Spatial Climate Impact Model. None of us can actually agree on how you pronounce it. I say DSIM. Other people say other things, but okay. And so this is all a collaboration between several institutions. All right, and we have this very modular analysis. Start with mortality, agriculture, energy sector, labor, coastal damages, and then we try and pull it all together in what we're calling our integration. Okay. This is what the damages are going to look like sector by sector. We're going to go through this. So I'm not asking you to absorb 6 figures like this all at once, but I'll just point out the damages are very different across sectors, even within a location. That this heterogeneity is an important thing that is being revealed by this data. Okay, so let's dive into the mortality sector. So where did those results come from that I showed you earlier? So the beginning point is kind of like it's embarrassing that we have to say this, but the beginning point is data. And so before we began this work, the view, I think the consensus view was that the mortality impacts of temperature changes from climate change would basically be 0. And so why did people think that? The reason they thought that is that almost all of the data that people had were from very rich, moderate temperature places. And so those places were going to benefit from getting rid of cold winter days. And since they were moderate temperatures, they were not moderate climates, they were not going to have very hot days. Even with climate change, that were going to lead to lots of mortality, and that the two things would kind of balance each other out. And so that was kind of the consensus. That was in IPCC reports, etc. And no one really paid attention to the fact, well, we were only using data from moderate and climate and relatively rich places. So our starting point was, well, maybe we should try and collect some data that covers the whole world, that reflects people face different climates, reflects people have different levels of income. And we spent a couple of years trying to do that, and this is basically what we could come up with. We're going to use this data to project the impacts everywhere around the world, but at least we have data in a much wider part of the distribution of current climate and current income. And this is actually meant to be a measure of, to give you a sense of this. So the gray areas are, each of these are one of our 25,000 regions. And here, this is their annual average temperature. Think of that as their climate. And this is their GDP per capita. And so you can see, oh, and then the colored boxes are ones where we actually have data. And so what you can see is that, like, the data we have, below a certain level of income, we don't have a lot of support in the data. We have some. So that's like a limitation of what we've done. We don't have any data for sub-Saharan Africa. However, if you were to project forward into the future, which is really what you're trying to do with climate change impacts, we actually match the data pretty well, in the sense that these places have all grown in terms of GDP, and they've risen into the regions of support where we actually have data. And so now we're trying to make projections, say, at the end of the century, that like sub-Saharan Africa might look like places that actually exist today. So this is imperfect. I wish we had data from everywhere around the world, but I want to give you a flavor of like the degree to which we have support in the data and the degree to which we're going to have to extend our estimates using functional form assumptions. Is that all tracking? Okay. So here's what we got as kind of a first set of results on mortality. So here we're going to have, I'm going to show you a series of results where on, you think of the outcome variable, the y-axis being deaths per 100,000. And then this is daily temperature. And for all ages, the 95% confidence interval kind of looks like this. This is around the world. For people less than 5, it looks like that. It's basically 0. And for 5 to 64, it's pretty flat too. And it turns out all the action is among people over 65. And so we all kind of instinctually had this U relationship in our mind. It turns out that once you start to bear down the data, that's all being driven by people who are 65. And there is this very sharp U relationship. If you take a day and swap it from 15 to 30, 35, you're going to increase the number of deaths per 100,000 across the whole world. Now, this is an average across the globe, and I'm now going to start to pick that apart and show you how it varies depending on places' current climate and depending on their current level of income. Does it make sense? So this is actually, this is from data. Okay, so the first thing we were wondering about is, well, is it true that mortality damages vary by climate? And so that is when a hot day arrives at a place that is used to hot days, all things equal, does it have the same impact as when a hot day arrives at places where hot days are pretty rare? And so this is the effect of a 35-degree day relative to a 20-degree day in the top decile of the planet coldest decile of the planet in terms of climate. And you can see there's a very large impact on mortality, maybe 15 extra deaths per 100,000 annually for that. Now I'm just going to start moving down deciles to get warmer. So the 9th decile, so that's the second coldest.
Excuse me. I have a question, if I may. I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, please. Interruptions are encouraged.
The mortality numbers that you showed, that does not include mortalities due to drought and, floods due to climate change.
It's all cause mortality.
So it's all cause mortality.
Yes.
Not only heat and cold.
So I think there's a lot of difficulty of, so people don't write on the death certificate heat and cold. They write things like, heart failure or something like that. And so rather than try and parse all that, we just said, we used all cause mortality and figured that to see if all cause mortality moves around, assuming that we would not be able to accurately tie it to particular causes of death. Yeah. Okay, so what I just want you to take away is, well, when you get to slightly warmer climate, the impact on mortality is still present, although it's substantially smaller. And now I'm going to go to the 8th decile, 7th decile, 6th decile, 5th decile. Okay, and so there's this really remarkable result, which is that, yes, it is true that there are impacts of very hot days, even in hot regions in the world, but those impacts are much smaller depending on the climate. And so that's going to be, we're going to interpret that as adaptation. When places see hot temperatures all the time, they figure out things to do. And I see your question, but I'm going to give you a favorite example of mine. It's very US centric, but Houston is in Texas. It gets hot days all the time. It's a very hot summer climate. Seattle has hot 35-degree days very infrequently. Houston and Seattle, at least in a global sense, basically have the same income. They basically have the same political systems. They, are alike on many, many dimensions. When a hot day arrives in Seattle, which happens very infrequently, it has like 8 times the impact on mortality rates that it does in Houston. And we're going to interpret that as adaptation. And if you've been to Houston, you can see there's tons of adaptation in Houston. They've developed a whole city where you don't have to go outside in the summer. There's air conditioning everywhere. People have learned to adjust their schedules. Nobody's outside in the middle of the day. And what we're going to be a big part of what we're going to do is say all those adaptations are great. They reduce the mortality impact. They're not going to be for free, and we're going to try and infer the costs associated with it. So there was a question. Yeah.
Death rates, right? So it's still going to be that the absolute numbers could be pretty large because the hotter places are also going to be relatively more populated. So
yeah. Okay, so that's one thing it's going to be central to what we're doing, is accounting for this adaptation, both the costs and the benefits. A second thing is, just as naturally as places get richer, they're going to start spending on health more. So, or at least that was our hypothesis. And so here, again, we have this response function. Now, the lowest tercile of income, and you can see what happens when a hot day arrives in relatively poor places. And then you can see what happens when it arrives in relatively middle income places. Then you can see what happens when it comes in high income places. And the key thing I just want you to see is like income is also protective. And that's going to be through the purchasing of cooling largely and a variety of other things that people do. So if you want to project what the impacts of climate change are going to be at the end of the century, you're going to take account of the adaptations that people are going to make in response to the changing climate. And you're going to have to account for the fact that, our children are going to be much richer than we are, or at least that's our standard projection. Okay. Couple other points, like I cooked this up because I knew it'd be here, and then I'm from Chicago. So this is the how might we go about quantifying the climate damages from mortality? The first thing is you got to start with what the distribution of daily temperatures are. So the green guys are the number of days per year that Chicago gets in different temperature bins, different temperature ranges. And you can see Chicago gets maybe to roughly the middle of the distribution for Delhi, and Delhi doesn't have all the nasty cold days that we have. And so here's the distribution for Delhi. So I guess Delhi gets maybe 50 days a year where the temperature, I think these are 1 degree bins, so let's call that 28 degrees C or something like that. And Delhi also gets these guys too, which are the very days. Okay, so what you're going to have to do, so the first thing to do is like, well, how's that distribution projected to change? So I think that's another thing that is central to the way we do this is rather than talking about the annual average, we talk about the days because it's the extreme nonlinearity in this relationship that drives the action. And so you want to capture what the daily temperatures are. And you can see this fat part of the distribution is going to get spread out into these very hot days in Delhi, and you also get some spreading out in Chicago as well. Okay, and so the next step is we're going to want to see what the response functions are between mortality and temperature in Delhi and Chicago. Oh, sorry, this is just subtracting one from the other. This is the change in the number of days. So this is saying Delhi will get 15 more days at, I don't know, 36, 37. Let's call that 5 more at 38 and 2 more at 40. And, a big reduction in the number of days around 30. Is that all making sense? Yeah. Okay. So
averages, maximum, minimum, what?
Oh yeah, good. Thank you. It's the average of the high and the low, and no accounting for humidity. This is we don't have the right data to do that. Okay, so what did we do here in this paper that we recently published? We developed these response functions, and we're going to allow them based on what you saw on how climate impacts the response function. That is, remember, in Houston, it's much less worse than it is in Seattle. Affects the response function. Here is the current response function in Chicago. It's much shallower, and in India, or Delhi, sorry. And when you take these changes in the temperature distributions and marry them to these response functions, this is what you would get for the change in deaths per 100,000 for in Chicago, where you'd have like kind of I guess in here in Chicago, it looks like it will benefit because you're getting rid of the cold days would be more beneficial than the additional hot days. And in Delhi, you'd have this very large increase. in total additional deaths. And here we were able, in this case, we were able to get at the causes of death a little bit, largely driven by cardiovascular deaths. Okay, so that kind of exercise allows one to do that, not just for Delhi, but for the entire country. And so here you can see how even within India, there's going to be very different impacts of climate change with respect to mortality, with the differences depending on how the climate and on the level of income.
The granularity of this data.
District. Yeah, district level. For India, it's district. In the US, it's county. Okay, any questions or is this all making sense? Yeah.
Just a quick question on the distribution, how the temperature distribution is expected to change over time. My understanding was that the winters also are expected to get harsher. I was surprised that the Chicago winter temperatures just seemed to be going up.
No. It's everything's getting warmer. There might be some more extreme events, but everything's getting warmer. It's not like we're getting colder winters and hotter summers. Like the whole distribution's moving.
And is that globally or would
That's
there be
globally.
parts of the
That's
world?
globally.
I see. Thank you.
But it's really good. So like, it's important to see, like, people talk about 2 degrees C change. Like, I think it's really important to, which is a global average over the whole year. It's important to see how that's distributed across days and how that varies across region. Exactly because of this extreme nonlinearity in the response function. No, they do. They adaptation. No. So it's exactly. Yes. You say resilient, I say spend money because I'm a cold-hearted economist. But I think like choosing not to jog in the middle of the day is like an expenditure of money as well. Like there's some utility you might like doing that, and now you can no longer do that. Yeah.
Do you take the level of adaptations that people have today as your correction, or do you also adjust for adaptations that will happen in future and then adjust?
Okay, so this is a great question. We project for the continued improvements in adaptation as incomes increase, but what we don't capture, what I think you're really thinking of, is if there's climate biased innovation. So record, the mainline estimates don't account for that. So like I was teasing whoever asked me that question earlier about, you know, the shirts that have the air conditioners built into them. Probably that's going to happen someday. And it wouldn't happen without climate change because it wouldn't be necessary. They still might be horrible and uncomfortable, but
you mentioned the cause of death was not necessarily temperature. So how do you attribute the cause of death in the chart that you mentioned?
yeah, so I misspoke. This is meant to give you a marker. This is the current death rate due to cardiovascular.
The question
just to
is,
show you how big it is. Oh, and here's another, this is a very nasty way to report this, but this is how the impacts will be distributed across the income distribution. So there'll be lots of increases, very large increases in deaths. This is at the end of the century. For today's low-income countries, smaller for middle income, High income are going to see a decrease in deaths for some of the reasons we talked about, the getting rid of the cold winter days. And then you're going to see, as I mentioned, and I didn't go into detail here, we also put some effort into trying to recover what we think the cost of adaptation will be, all the added expenditures on energy and a variety of other costly actions people are going to take. And so, you know, the nasty thing, a part of this is effectively, it's, you know, economists are supposed to be comfortable with this. I'm not really comfortable with this. Dollars are not the same thing as deaths. And so there'd be like expenditures on money on adaptation. And in the low income countries, you're going to have increases in mortality and not as much of expenditures, whereas the rich countries are going to largely deal with it by spending a lot of money. This is just one measure of how the mortality. So this is converting the mortality impacts into dollars using the value of statistical life, which I suspect most of you are familiar with, given the audience. And here you can see how you know, Pakistan and Bangladesh are projected to have the largest impacts. This is converting the deaths into dollars, and you can see how else it's distributed around the world, very, very unequally. If you were to add it all up globally, one point I want to make is if you assume that there is no adaptation, you end up with these very, very large numbers. But once you begin to allow for adaptation and all the benefits of adopting air conditioning and the air conditioned shirts and whatever it is, becoming more like Houston, the costs go down by quite a bit, but are still quite substantial. This is just to the end of the century. We looked at this before. This is how the impacts are going to be projected to be distributed in each of these 25,000 regions, and we pulled out some of the ones that we think are especially illuminating.
In many slides, you compare the mortality and temperature over in Chicago, but Delhi comes under the northern India, and people in northern facing a very wide variability of temperature, and below 5 degrees or 6 degrees. So here people are very much accustomed to variability in the temperature. So even if a 1 degree or 2 degrees Celsius, if temperature would rise, I don't think it will very sharper impact on mortality. How do you see? I mean, this.
I think you're saying, so the current way we're allowing it to vary is with the annual average. And I think you're saying places that maybe we need a second moment too.
It might mean not only a temperature, but many factors who can be.
That's fair. That's outside of what we've done. That doesn't mean we couldn't do it. That's a good point.
Not only temperature, it could be many factors who can lead a mortality, not only temperature.
Yeah.
Because for a very long time, we are facing these variation in temperature. We live in a 35 degrees Celsius, and we also live in a 5 degrees Celsius. So what if 35 became a 37 or 38? I don't think.
So we experimented with allowing the cold deaths to vary with how frequently you have really cold temperatures, and the hot deaths to vary with how frequently you had very hot temperatures. And the truth is that model didn't do much better than just using the annual average. And so that's why we are just using the annual average, which it's possible. We're also beginning to push the data to its limits. So it's possible with richer data, you could uncover more.
I was a little curious about the graph on the costs for countries at different income levels, adaptation costs. Would they also include things like foregone productivity costs. So for instance, in a richer country, maybe the adaptation is not jogging in the middle of the day, whereas in a poorer country, it's not going to work for a few hours in the day. Because I'm surprised that it's so low for, it's not higher for the low income countries.
Yeah, okay. So I think the question is, why aren't the adaptation costs higher for low income countries? And so the way, what comes out of the data is that there are much greater willingness to accept mortality and less to restrict economic opportunities. And so that's like a very, very uncomfortable finding here, which is that it seems to be that like there's almost like that the increase in mortality, that most of the, this could be divided any way between these two categories. And in the data, it looks like it's primarily being driven by increases in mortality.
So higher income countries are just spending that much more to adapt to changes, so they offset these productivity losses as well.
Yeah.
Proportion of low-income countries are much more higher in torrid zone perhaps than in the tropics, because much of the Europe and North America is actually in the northern hemisphere and above the tropic. So could it be that people from low-income countries are already in the torrid zone and therefore they're much more accustomed to that heat and therefore the costs are lower to adapt?
So that should all be reflected in this. At least is captured by annual average temperature. Maybe there's another variable that annual average temperature is not that would be a good addition, but it's captured by annual average temperature. It's all in here. Okay, one more question.
Costs. Yeah, here, when we look at the change in deaths by after some adaptation methods have been incorporated, we also have installing air conditions as one of the additional costs.
As a cost, yeah.
So increase in energy might also then lead to increase in global
Yeah,
temperatures.
yeah. There's a nasty circularity there. I'm going to cover that in a few minutes and more fully. The question is, hey, are we just going to, through adaptation, we're going to cause more climate change by using the energy? The answer is yes. Okay, so in fact, next is the electricity sector. So that's what we did with mortality. I'm not going to go into great detail about electricity or labor, but I'll give you a flavor of it. Here's how the damages are spread across electricity with lots of areas benefiting. So for electricity, we have much wider coverage of data. So less extrapolation is necessary. Okay, so this was, I found, like a pretty shocking result. This is, again, a U relationship between electricity consumption and, high electricity consumption when it's very cold, high when it's very hot, and moderated electricity consumption when temperatures are pretty temperate. Now, what I've done here is that's just for the countries that are in the top decile of income. Okay. I'm now going to show you what happens when we start to move down the income distribution. This is a current distribution of income. Okay, oops. Okay, so here's decile 9, decile 8, decile 7. That U relationship starts to disappear. And everything we knew, I think that the literature knew, was basically this U relationship. But what that missed was that when you start to move down the distribution, the U relationship is gone. And so there was this question about adaptation. Why isn't there evidence of more adaptation in today's low-income countries? And at least with respect to electricity, what you're seeing here is when the hot days come and when the cold days come, there's no response in terms of increased electricity consumption. And so there's no adaptation expenditures. And I think that's why in the last paper, we saw so much extra death in those countries because they're not rich enough to be able to start spending on electricity to as a protective device or protective investment against the damages from heat and cold. Does that make sense? No. Okay, so let's go again. In high income places, you have this very sharp U relationship. Hot day comes, people are going to spend a lot on electricity. That's for this. Cold day comes, people are going to spend a lot doing something to heat themselves one way or another. That's the richest decile of the world. The ninth decile, that starts to go away, just a little bit. Eighth decile, that's very different than here. But sixth, there is no relationship between when a hot day comes or cold day comes and electricity consumption. What does that mean in plain English? That means those countries are too poor to start using electricity to protect themselves against the risk posed by hot and cold temperatures. Yeah. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, and so that is meant to connect something that was a little mysterious in the mortality paper. Why were all the damages in the poor countries coming through mortality and not through adaptation costs? Well, here's a primary form of adaptation costs, and it's saying, well, there weren't large adaptation costs because these countries did not feel rich enough to be able to, or didn't have the resources, the infrastructure, whatever it is, to be able to do that. So this is a very shocking result that we did not expect. Okay.
So because the low income countries, as such, they do not consume much of electricity. So the variation, I mean, the U is about all about variation, right?
Yeah.
So if a country is consuming less than 1,000 units per capita, so I mean, there's a baseline effect here, it seems.
Yeah, I would just call it income.
Yeah, so it's affordability, right?
Hmm?
Affordability?
Yeah. I would just call it income. Or we're proxying for it with income. Okay, here's where we are. So what happened between 1971 and 2012? Well, India moved from the lowest decile, I don't know if this is the fourth or fifth. The US moved from the 9th to 10th. Here's South Korea, other countries. These are projections by the end of the century. By the end of the century, India is projected to be in today's top decile. Of course, that isn't necessarily the top decile at the end of the century, but it'd be today's top decile. And so, but all I want you to take away from that is that means there's several decades coming of increasing temperatures until countries start to get here where there's projected to be not lots of energy response to these high temperatures that are coming. Okay. When you add it all up, this is the impact of climate change on the consumption of energy. This is in 2100. And this is how it's distributed around the planet. Okay, so that's electricity. Does that make sense? Okay. Now we'll look at labor. This is not labor productivity, this is labor supply. Are people less likely to show up for work when it's really hot or when it's really cold? This is what it's going to look like at the end. And here's the data that we had. It's difficult to get data for this. India is one country we're able to get data from. Some South American countries, some European countries, Mexico. And again, we're going to use that to project for the whole world. When you divide, so the first thing we found is when you divide the labor force into high risk and low risk, the way we did is high risk are agricultural, mining, construction, and manufacturing, and low risk is basically all other sectors. There we see effectively almost no relationship till it gets very, very hot among low risk workers. So that is they basically come to work You have an office job, you're going to come to work regardless whether or not it's hot or cold. That's what that's saying. For high-risk workers, you have this upside down U. And you can see that the very cold days, but especially the very hot days, keep people out of the office. Or well, these guys are, office is probably the wrong thing, away from the workplace. Largely because they're exposed to these high temperatures. When you put it all together, you get this, which is some mashup of the high risk and the low risk workers. This is, if you quantified that lost labor supply. So, sorry, to put this in English, 35-degree day would reduce the amount of time that the average high-risk worker spent working maybe by about half an hour is a way to think of it. Okay, when you put that all together, this is how the damages would be distributed around the planet. Again, you can see how unequal they are around the world. And a lot of that depends on the starting climate and the starting share of high risk versus low risk workers. Okay, so those are some examples. We have some other sectors that we work on. Those are three maybe most well-developed ones. Another area that is very important that had not been previously accounted for is to try and characterize.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, please.
For the high-risk workers, since they're already in a high-risk environment, why do?
Yeah, terrible to work outside when it's 35 degrees and people don't show up.
Exposing themselves to a lot. So natural that they might respond.
I think what this is trying to say is like, yes, they're probably better at it than you or me, but they still have a terrible time with it.
I can attempt an answer to that because you're not looking what I asked earlier about the wet bulb. So the wet bulb.
Yes, not wet
So
bulb.
it's not just heat; it's also humidity.
That's
and
true.
a combination of heat and humidity effectively at a certain temperature will incapacitate you totally. So it's not just that, oh, I'm used to the heat. The body has a limit to which it can handle heat come humidity, which can actually lead to even death. So the amount of time you can actually physically spend doing things like agriculture and so on is drastically reduced. And things like agriculture, you can't shift time of day too much, So I think, in fact, I would argue that these numbers are lower bounds on what you would actually get in terms of, and ILO, for example, has done some of these numbers. And so I find these pretty plausible and frightening.
Okay. Okay, characterization of uncertainty. We don't know what's going to happen to the climate change with any certainty. Here is the projected under two climate change scenarios, RCP 4.5 and RCP 8.5. 8.5 is more extreme. We don't actually know what the temperature change is going to be. We kind of know a distribution. And so we can't say with certainty we're going to be in the middle of this distribution. We might get a draw all the way out here. That'd be terrible. Or if we're in the red path of emissions, we might get a draw here instead of a draw here. That's enormously consequential, given the shape of this uncertainty, given the shape of the damages, how it's very nonlinear. Getting an extra going from 3 to 4 degrees change, versus 0 to 1 is very, very different. And so the problem is it's plausible that there's lots of weight, there's some weight here. So one thing we want to do is take account of this uncertainty. It is also true, as proud as I am of our econometric estimates of the damages, we don't know those perfectly either. I don't know if you can see it, but we have tried to represent the 95% confidence intervals around those estimates. And so those are also known with uncertainty. And there are, of course, additional sources of uncertainty, the emissions path that will be on, socioeconomic scenarios, and the rate of technological change. And all of those things, people hate uncertainty. Like, that's why they buy insurance, car insurance, as they don't want to face the bad state of the world where they crash the car and they have to replace it completely. They want some protection against that. So, and here's some local examples. I think I showed you Accra earlier. This is the median, the mean of what's expected to happen, but there's this big right tail and there's plenty of mass over there too. And you can do the same thing for Sao Paulo, even though on average it looks like Sao Paulo is gonna, the impact is gonna be about 0. There's some possibility of big negative impact. So in fact, there's an 8% probability that the deaths, impact on deaths will be greater than 500 per 100,000, which would be just explosively horrible in Accra. And that you can see that from here. And there's maybe like a 75% probability the deaths are going to be greater than the malaria death rate in Brazil currently. In Accra, sorry. And then you can do the same kinds of exercises. So can we take account of that uncertainty and you feed it into our valuations? So you saw this already. This is the impacts, total mortality impacts at the end of the century. What we tried to do was to characterize economic and climate uncertainty. And when we did that, we get these ranges. The gray is the 25th to 75th percentile, and larger would be 10th to 90th. And so you can see there's lots of uncertainty here. And that's not just true in the mortality sector, that's true in all of these sectors. And here's our canonical intermediate micrograph, which is, we could end up, this is utility, and this is consumption with no climate change, or one version of climate change, or second version of climate change. And you can see, here's the two extremes. People would be willing to give up, willing to pay a fair amount to ensure that they not have to face those extremes. And so when we pull this all together, we're going to have, we're going to account for how people dislike this uncertainty in a way that has not been done previously. Okay, so let's try and add all that up right now. Okay, so what will the climate damages look like year by year? These are, this is what I showed you at the beginning. These are mean damages as a percentage of GDP per capita in 2099. This is the total climate damages year by year, which, and this is just meant to baseline. Global GDP is about $100 trillion per year right now. And you can see how that's expected to grow with the uncertainty around it. I think it is not actually super useful. This is interesting to look at, but it's a strange counterfactual. It's like a world where there wasn't climate change versus a world with climate change. That's not a relevant counterfactual. We have climate change. It's no longer a choice not to have it. So I think the right way to think about it is really as a marginal problem, which is how much is an extra ton of CO2? And the way to capture that is this object called the social cost of carbon. I would say it's the most important number you've never heard of. It's the monetary value of the damages imposed by the release of one additional ton of CO2. And I would argue that for every climate change mitigation policy, the social cost of carbon is central to determine whether or not it's cost effective, because it's giving you what the benefits are. The damages you can avoid by releasing 1 fewer ton of CO2. So let's take a look at this. This is a 4-panel graph. I love this graph that explains what an additional ton of CO2 does. So here we're shoot up an additional blip of CO2, and it goes up in the atmosphere. That influences CO2 concentrations. Very sharp increase. Then the oceans start to take in some of that CO2, and then the oceans start to release it. So it actually has this funny shape. It first goes up, then down. What happens to temperature change? This is the time pattern for that. And I just want to point out, this goes out to 2300. That's very far away from each additional ton of CO2 we're doing today. And then each additional ton of CO2 is going to unleash damages year by year. Exactly because it's influencing temperature out to 2300. And here's what those damages look like year by year. And now we can just take the present value of that with standard discount calculation. And that would tell you what the total social cost of carbon is, or the stream of damages that you're unleashing, I'm unleashing, we're all unleashing every time we put out additional ton of CO2. Okay, when you add that all together, I think this is a little too wonky for today. The US government version, which was based on the original IAMs, was about $51. And using this approach that I've outlined, the DSIM model, it's almost $200. It's $189. And it accounts, and here's these empirically based damage functions, subnational heterogeneity, accounts for uncertainty, and endogenous just kind of, by no means is it perfect. It's missing some other things as well. Okay, armed with that, that's super useful. Now we know each additional ton is $200. You can do all kinds of fun calculations now. How costly? Yeah, what is that? That accounts for that you would want to discount heavily periods when we're rich and discount lightly periods when we're poor. And so if you, yeah, no, it's basically Ramsey discounting. Think of it like that. Oh, because it depends on G, the growth rate. And so we're going to let climate damages enter the growth rate. Does that make sense?
I mean, because there's all this debates about the
Yes.
how you manage what kind of
Yes. So it's all captured in our approach to discounting, which in the essence of it is you want to avoid big climate damages when you're poor, and they're not so bad when you're rich, and that's just because the marginal utility of income is different, and that's reflected in this approach to discounting. Like, we could spend a whole 2 hours on that alone, and that's a very, very fulsome literature with many, many strong views, as you well know. But I think what we've done is not controversial. Okay, so then you can do all kinds of really cool exercises, I think. If you know that the marginal, if you know the social cost of carbon, you can figure out the damages associated from emissions each year. So China is doing about 10 billion tons of CO2 per year. That means they're doing about $2 trillion of damages. They're producing $2 trillion of climate damages for the world each year. The US is almost $1 trillion. The European Union is about $540 billion, and India is about 460. If you add it all up, you would you know, climate damages are maybe $6.5 trillion that are being done afresh each year from CO2 emissions.
So accounting for this uncertainty means that the social cost of carbon is very high. It also means that there are potentially huge returns to just reducing that uncertainty.
Yeah.
So I mean, some of that uncertainty is irreducible because the world is stochastic, but I was wondering if you know, if you just throw money at reducing this uncertainty, potentially that's, I mean, has huge returns.
Huge returns to more economics research.
Yeah.
So I'm in favor of that. You know, farmers also believe there should be greater farm subsidies too. But I totally agree. If we could shrink the uncertainty, that would help us a lot. And some of that could be done with more research, and some of that we're just going to figure out over time as we understand the climate system better. Okay, so how might you use this to think about policy? Well, here's this is I skipped over this earlier. The U.S. has a wild suite of incoherent policies, climate policies. Here's just a listing of some: cash for clunkers, that was buying used cars; weatherization assistance, that's like doing energy efficiency upgrades on people's homes, and just a long list here. These are estimates of the costs of these policies per ton of CO2. And what you can see is that at the old number, $51, a lot of these had costs that exceeded the benefits they were producing. Seemed like maybe not good policies to do. Once you have a higher social cost of carbon, it takes a whole bunch of policies that look kind of questionable, at least on a cost benefit basis, and kind of puts them into the black as something where the benefits exceed the cost. So that's one way in which it's useful. Yeah, this is meant to show you the area that cost per ton policies that would be socially desirable with cost benefit analysis, and how that varies with the social cost of carbon. And I'm putting these up just to be provocative. There are also things you can do. Solar radiation management. Do people know what that is? So that is solar radiation management is we continue emitting CO2, but it just gets too hot, and some country freaks out. Could be Pakistan, could be India, could be Saudi Arabia. It's just too hot. And the global approach to reducing CO2 isn't working. So what we're going to do is we're going to shoot particles into the air that would reflect sunlight. And even though the CO2 concentrations are staying the same, they would reflect some of the sunlight and prevent the planet from heating up so much. And you know, you could do that. You'd have to keep doing it because the particles fall to the ground. It would have to be kind of a continuous thing. It's pretty inexpensive to do that, to be honest. And in principle, it could be done by a single country. So I don't know how we would agree on who should be in charge. And you could imagine that that would be very complicated. Russia might like a higher temperature than India, say. And so one thing you could do with the social cost of carbon is we'll see what are the benefits of getting rid of some of the extra temperature increase. And a second thing one can do is carbon dioxide removal. We talked about that in the first talk. And that's where you can take the CO2 that's already been emitted and pull it out of the sky at some cost. Okay. So how would you use this? So here are estimates. Direct air capture is one way of reducing CO2, carbon dioxide removal. Here's some estimates of the costs per ton. They range from maybe, according to this estimate, from $600 per ton and up. A more recent one has it somewhere between 200 and 1,000. That was in 2018 versus 2011. The IEA today puts it somewhat tighter range. Let's call that maybe 150 to 350 We don't really know. And here's projected time pass of how those costs might decline through the end of the century from the Global CS Institute. And here's how, using DSIM, how the social cost of carbon is expected to grow over time. And what you can see is that there are various crossing points where actually doing direct air capture looks like the benefits would exceed the costs. And a lot of that depends on where direct air capture ends. So point is this, it would be a guidepost to how much we might be willing to spend per ton on CDR. Oh, okay. And then here is just a fun little exercise we did of using our damages, projected damages at the end of the century. This is the change in global mean surface temperatures. At the end of the century, what the damages are expected to look like associated with that, and what happened. So like a baseline scenario is probably about 3.5 degree change. What happens if you just reduce that by 1 degree using solar radiation management, by putting particles up in the air? And you can see that that's the savings you would get from SRM. And so again, this is a social cost of carbon is a super flexible tool. It can tell you whether or not that is a socially desirable thing to do. Okay, so here's the savings from SRM. All right, so let me end with where I began. Advances in economics and climate science allow for the quantification of global and local level estimates of damages associated with climate change. What we are finding is that damages are larger and more heterogeneous than previously thought. The costs are especially concentrated in today's poor and hot places. The second big point is the social cost of carbon is very important summary measure of climate damages. And the new social cost of carbon estimates suggest that current annual emissions we're gifting to our children about $6.5 trillion worth of damages per year. And these can be used to guide mitigation as well as kind of more explorative fancy policies like CDR and SRM. So I'd be happy to answer questions for a few minutes, but this is the last slide.
Exactly is green GDP in the context of the social cost of carbon
You
calculation?
just subtract off the $6.5 trillion. Yeah.
What's that?
Yeah. So green GDP, the idea of green GDP is, and this would only account for the CO2 part. Maybe there's other environmental damages that should be subtracted off. But the question is, how would you use the social cost of carbon to adjust global GDP figures for the damages that we're gifting to our children? And my answer is you take global GDP and then you would subtract off this $6.5 trillion and say, that's what the world really produced. It didn't actually produce what gets reported as GDP.
Yeah, it seems to me that you've done some kind of bootstrapping, and then, yeah. Another way to characterize uncertainty would be to look at each of those individual parameters and, think about what are the upper and lower limits. And then, because my concern is that by doing this, some effects may cancel out other effects. And
Yeah, it depends on the correlation.
yeah.
We could do that. I mean, we've sampled the full space. So there are some assumptions that go into that.
My fear is that there's
This is a fair question. It's a fair question. Yeah.
I had a doubt. So how do the climatic models work? So given the emissions, where are they located? So is it like globally uniform? So wherever you emit CO2, it will impact global.
Oh yeah, the great thing about studying CO2, but is it doesn't matter where you emit it. A ton emitted in Mumbai is the same as a ton emitted in Detroit.
Because I was thinking if you like change using say trade routes, changing the trade routes and changing the production centers. So can that be an adaptation mechanism as well?
No, it doesn't matter where you, if I understood the question, it doesn't matter where you emit CO2.
Okay.
Same impact everywhere.
So I just I was just wondering that how did you zero down Delhi as for comparing with the Chicago? Like, what is the rational?
Why did I pull out Delhi?
Yeah.
Because I'm in Delhi.
So there is no.
I mean, I could have pulled out one of 25,000 regions. I thought, hey, the one that might be most interesting to people here would be the Delhi one.
If you
I could have pulled out Anchorage, Alaska too.
No. I was wondering that if you will take comparison between the Calcutta and the Chicago, you will be having a very different result because as one was pointing out, there is a humidity factor that plays out in India as well, not only just hot conditions.
Look, one of the things I hope you take away from this is the impacts are going to be very, very different around the world and very, very different within inside countries. And that's what this data is unlocking. Before, we made the insane assumption that the impact in Miami, the United States, is going to be flooded. And short of some heroic disappear, that the impacts would be the same as Minneapolis. But that's the point I want you to take away is like, matter where you are.
So just to clarify the earlier question, the impact of an additional ton of CO2 emissions, whether in Brazil or in other parts of the world, would increase global concentrations of CO2 by the same amount.
The same.
But the marginal damage would obviously vary by location, which is what you're saying.
100%, yes. That's
And
what,
also it's not just the global mean surface temperature, but the world would warm in very different ways.
yes.
But I would still want to make one last ditch attempt to resurrect these IAMs. So if you have say a regional model like the RICE, which is the regional model, I could calibrate that model with damage functions to give me very different results. For example, I could have a highly convex damage function, which is region specific. And I believe fund and so on can be even much more parsed to give you very high damages. So I think Nordhaus 1993 is a bit of a straw man because the new regional models
So do you
can
want my-
even incorporate convexities of the Weitzman type and so on.
Okay. So I've been talking for 3 hours straight, more or less. So I'm getting a little punch drunk. So I'm going to answer this in a super sharp way. If you have a car, you take out the steering wheel and you replace it. You take out the engine and you replace it. And you take out the brakes and you replace it. And you take out the wheels and you replace them. Is it the same car anymore? That's what I'm saying. So I look, yeah, of course you can incorporate that in IAMs. You better also incorporate better climate models. They have very unsophisticated climate models in them that have this geographic resolution, to your point, that the temperature changes. Yes, 1 ton of CO2 changes atmospheric CO2 the same, but it doesn't change temperature the same. And we capture all that. And so look, I don't care. You take our damage functions, you put them in dice, it's fine. But at some point, like, it's not the same car anymore. That would be my 3-hour in answer. At 4.5 hours in later this afternoon, you can ask again, it'll be even nastier. But I want to, but look, I also want to be clear, like, we're all standing on the shoulders of the giants who created the IAMs. That was a very, very coherent way to think about it. It was just unfortunate for them. This was a period when there really wasn't computers that were up to the task. And so they did the best they could. But what I want to communicate is we're in a new era here.
Okay, so if I remember correctly, in one of the initial slides, you also mentioned the climate change also damages the integration.
Sorry, the what?
Integration, I think somewhere you mentioned in the initial slides.
Oh.
So if you could explain a little bit what is that and how?
Oh, that's
you
just pulling all the sectors together.
Okay.
That's just pulling all the sectors together.
Okay.
Yeah. But I do want to highlight, because I think this is at the back of what you're asking. And it was, we don't have anything to say about this. This is like, it feels like there's a lot of bad stuff here. That's where crop failure interacts with migration, interacts with political violence, interacts with people wanting to go across borders. We don't have anything to say about that. Not because I don't believe it's important. We haven't found a way to wrap our arms around it empirically. So I don't, if that's what you were getting at, that's not in our integration. It should be, but we haven't found a way to do it yet.
I mean, now, even the carbon tariff is being also discussed. So when you also trade the goods,
yeah,
you also leakage some kind of carbon.
Yeah.
How are you going to control that? Suppose so that means there has been some kind of gains from trade as well. So there is also loss if you are trying to impose some kind of tariff on those goods, isn't it? So if you have accounted for that, there might be some loss from the integration, isn't it?
It's possible, yeah.
I mean, there are also work who also accounted for the loss from the carbon tariff.
So the carbon tariff is a different issue than we're going to cover today.
Yeah, so my question is sort of, not directly related to the theme, but something you mentioned about this endogenous discounting business. And it seems to, I don't know whether I've got you correctly, but it seems that the richer countries will be more willing to, their discount rate, they'll be more patient, and presumably they'll be willing to therefore, pay more, invest more in climate change. And in that doesn't seem to, if you look at the political economy of, then that would mean that they'll be willing to invest and subsidize the poorer countries. But it seems that there's a lot of problem in terms of coming an agreement with that, because it tallies to different theories.
Are you asking why we don't have rational global climate policy?
So,
no one invited me to talk about that.
I don't know whether you have it in the slide, but what is the actual econometric model that you estimate? I mean, we didn't see any regressions or GMM or anything. Do you have it in the slide? What's the?
No, so it's yeah, so this is what you want. You want the equation that determines this. It's annual deaths per 100,000 as a function of the number of times that the day appears in small temperature bins over that year. Full stop. Then interact it with income and interact it with climate. And that's what we're recovering.
That's the regression that you run.
That's the regression we run. Yeah. Yeah. No, fair question. Should have been there.
Okay, so thank you, Michael. So informative talk and basically covering this whole climate change business, and the third lecture may talk about more about the policies.
Yeah.
So thank you so much, and a big applause for now. Mostly make some announcements.
Yeah, so again, a few announcement about the logistics. So after the lunch, we are going to have the contributory session. So all the speakers for the contributory session, please look up the program, identify the room, and then, report there around 1:45. The student volunteers are going to be there to help you to put up your presentations. And for all our invited guests, please join us for lunch.